Driving through the forest was usually peaceful, but that night, it felt off. The tall trees seemed to close in, and the dirt road felt narrower than usual. I was delivering a load to a cabin deep in the woods. The owner had called for an urgent delivery, and even though I had a bad feeling, I took the job. The darkness was heavy, the only light coming from my truck's headlights. I could hear the engine humming and the leaves rustling. After a while, my GPS stopped working, and I had to use an old map. The cabin was supposed to be about 15 miles in, but after 20 miles, I still didn't see it. I pulled over to check the map again, and that's when I heard it. A soft, steady tapping. I turned off the engine to listen better. The tapping kept going, coming from the trees just beyond the road. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out, the cold night air hitting me right away. I walked toward the sound, my boots crunching on the gravel. The tapping got louder, more urgent. I shone the flashlight around, seeing branches and leaves. Then I saw it, a cabin, barely visible through the thick trees, not far off the road. It wasn't the cabin I was supposed to deliver to, but I thought maybe someone there could help me. As I got closer, I noticed the door was slightly open, moving with the wind. The tapping was louder now, almost unbearable. I pushed the door open with my foot and stepped inside. The air was stale, and the place looked abandoned. Furniture was knocked over, and dust covered everything. The tapping was coming from an old grandfather clock in the corner, its pendulum swinging wildly even though the rest of it was broken. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something was wrong. I turned to leave and noticed a photo on the floor, half buried under junk. It was a picture of a family, smiling. The date on the back was from over 20 years ago. I put it in my pocket, thinking I might find someone who knew them. I hurried back to my truck, the bad feeling growing. As I started the engine and drove away, I glanced back at the cabin. In the headlights, I saw movement at one of the windows. A shadowy figure standing there, watching me. I sped up, not stopping until I was far away from that place. I finally reached a gas station at the edge of the forest, the first sign of people in miles. I went inside and showed the clerk the photo. His face went pale. He told me that the family in the picture had disappeared without a trace years ago. The cabin had been empty ever since. I delivered my load the next day, but the memory of that night stayed with me. I never took another job that led me through that forest again. Every now and then, I think about the figure at the window, the steady tapping, and the abandoned cabin. It makes me wonder what else is out there, waiting to be found. Or worse, waiting to find us. I'd been driving for hours, hoping the forest road would eventually lead me out of the woods. I took this route to avoid traffic, but now it felt like I was stuck in the darkest part of the forest. My headlights barely cut through the thick trees, their long shadows making me uneasy. Earlier, I had seen something strange, a shape moving between the trees, always just out of view. I thought it was just my tired eyes playing tricks, but as night fell, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The forest was full of creaks and snaps that echoed through the silence. My truck's engine started to sputter as I went around a curve, and I knew something was wrong. I pulled over, hoping it was just a small issue. As I got out, the cold air hit me hard, and the forest seemed to close in, the trees pressing against the darkness. I opened the hood, but before I could figure out what was wrong, I heard it, a faint rustling nearby, like something moving through the leaves. My flashlight flickered as I swung it around, but I saw nothing. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, but the sounds kept getting closer. I grabbed my wrench and started working on the engine, my hands shaking. Every few seconds, I'd glance over my shoulder, looking for any sign of movement. That's when I saw it, a shadowy figure moving between the trees, its shape too human to be comforting. Panic hit me as I tightened the last bolt and slammed the hood shut. I jumped back into the truck, locked the doors, and started the engine. The truck roared to life, but as I put it in gear, the figure seemed to get closer, standing still and watching me. I slammed the gas pedal, speeding down the road. The figure was gone, but the fear didn't go away. I drove as fast as I could, and the trees finally started to thin out. I looked back one last time and saw nothing but darkness. Eventually, the trees gave way to open fields, and the forest was behind me. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. Even now, as I sit in the safety of a lit diner, the memory of that night won't leave me. The worst part? I still can't shake the feeling that whatever was out there is still watching me. The way the figure was so still, so silent, I have this chilling sense that it's been following me all this time. And as I sit here, alone in the diner, I can't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see those dark eyes peering in through the window. I was taking a shortcut through the forest, eager to get home before dark. The sky was a dull gray, and the thick branches overhead kept the light out. My boots crunched on the leaf-covered path, and the smell of wet earth was all around me. I'd walked this trail many times, but today something felt wrong. The usual bird calls were missing, and the trees seemed to close in tighter with every step. I told myself it was just my imagination and that the silence was getting to me. After what felt like hours, I realized I should have reached the clearing by now. I checked my phone for directions, but the battery was dead. I tried to retrace my steps, hoping to find the main path, but the forest looked different in the fading light. The trees seemed to shift, and the path that had been familiar now felt like a maze. The daylight quickly faded, and I felt a growing sense of fear. My heart pounded as shadows grew longer, and the forest became a dark wall around me. I knew I had to keep moving or risk being stuck here overnight. I stumbled upon a small, run-down cabin. It was the only building I'd seen since getting lost. Desperate for shelter, I approached, hoping someone might be inside or that it could at least offer some cover. The door creaked open, revealing a dusty, musty interior. There was no one there, but it seemed safe enough to stay for the night. As I settled in, I noticed an old map pinned to the wall. I studied it and saw a path leading straight to the edge of the forest. My heart leaped with hope. I made a mental note of the route and tried to get some rest on the rickety bed. In the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by a sound outside. It was a faint rustling, like someone, or something, moving through the underbrush. My breath caught in my throat. I lay still, straining to hear. The noise stopped, and I thought maybe it was just an animal. I tried to calm myself and went back to sleep. When morning came, I followed the map's directions, and the journey out of the forest was slow but steady. Each step away from the cabin felt like a small victory. Finally, I emerged from the trees into open fields and saw the familiar landmarks of my rude home. I was relieved to be back on solid ground and out of the forest. As I looked back, I noticed something unsettling. The cabin was no longer there. It was as if it had vanished overnight. I remembered the map and how it had shown a path out. But then I thought of something else. If the cabin had disappeared, what else in the forest might have changed while I was inside? I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in the forest was still out there, waiting for the next lost soul to wander in. I always loved the idea of spending a weekend alone in a cabin. When I found one to rent deep in the woods, I jumped at the chance. It was supposed to be a peaceful escape, a break from my busy life in the city. I arrived on a Friday afternoon. The sun was setting behind the trees, casting long shadows over the gravel driveway. The cabin was small but cozy. It had a fireplace, a little kitchen, and a loft bedroom. I unpacked my things, made a quick dinner, and settled in for the night with a book. At first, the quiet was nice. I could hear the wind moving through the trees and an owl hooting in the distance. As the night went on, the quiet started to feel creepy. Every creak of the cabin sounded louder in the silence. I kept telling myself it was just the old wood settling, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I went to bed early, hoping a good night's sleep would help. I woke up in the middle of the night to a noise outside. It sounded like something heavy moving through the bushes. I got out of bed and looked out the window. In the dim moonlight, I could just make out a figure near the trees. It was too dark to see clearly, but it looked like a man. I told myself it was probably just a hiker or a hunter, someone who had gotten lost. But the figure didn't move, and the longer I watched, the more scared I felt. I forced myself to go back to bed, pulling the covers over my head like a child. The next day, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I decided to go for a walk to clear my mind. The woods were beautiful in the daylight, and I started to feel a bit silly for being so scared the night before. But as I walked, I found tracks in the dirt, leading away from the cabin. They were human tracks, deep and fresh. I followed them for a while, but they veered off into a thicker part of the woods. I decided to turn back, not wanting to get lost. When I got back to the cabin, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a footprint on the porch, just outside the door. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept the lights on and a knife by my bed. Around midnight, I heard the noise again. This time, it was closer, right outside the window. My heart pounded in my chest as I crept to the window and looked out. The figure was back, standing just a few feet away. I could see him clearly now, a man with a scraggly beard and dirty clothes. He was staring right at me. I panicked, grabbing my phone to call for help. But there was no signal. I was alone. I decided to confront him, grabbing the knife and opening the door. But when I stepped outside, he was gone. I stood there, knife in hand, my breath coming in short gasps, feeling both foolish and terrified. The next morning, I packed up and left as quickly as I could. I never looked back. I reported the incident to the rental agency, but they said no one had ever had any problems there before. Maybe it was just a drifter passing through, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly avoided something terrible. Back in the city, I tried to put the weekend behind me. But sometimes, late at night, I hear noises outside my window. When I look out, I swear I see that same figure, standing just a few feet away, staring at me. I moved to get away from him, but what if he followed me? What if he's still out there, watching and waiting? It was late afternoon when I decided to hike the old trail behind my cabin. The forest had always been my peaceful retreat, but today, something felt off. The usual bird songs were missing, and a strange quiet seemed to fill the woods. The trail was overgrown, with thick bushes and tangled roots, making each step a careful move. About an hour in, I saw something strange, footprints. They were bigger than mine and looked fresh. I thought they were from another hiker and pushed on, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling growing inside me. As dusk fell, the shadows in the forest stretched long and spooky. I checked my watch. It was later than I thought. I hurried up, eager to get back before dark. The trees above thickened, blocking out most of the fading light, and the forest seemed to close in around me. Suddenly, I heard a twig snap behind me. I stopped dead, my heart racing. I turned around, but there was nothing. Only the rustling of leaves in the wind. I tried to ignore it and kept moving, but the sound of footsteps seemed to follow me, always just out of sight. The trail started to twist and turn, and I found myself lost in a part of the forest I didn't recognize. Panic set in as I realized I had wandered far from the familiar path. I pulled out my flashlight and turned it on, its beam cutting through the thickening darkness. As I pushed through the underbrush, I came across an old, abandoned hunting cabin. Its door hung off its hinges, and the windows were broken. A chill ran down my spine, not from the cold but from the feeling of being watched. I approached the cabin, hoping to find any sign of recent human activity, or at least a place to wait until morning. Inside, the cabin was dark and musty, smelling of decay. My flashlight revealed old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. Just as I was about to leave, I noticed a strange mark on the wall, something like a large, crude symbol scratched into the wood. The hairs on my neck stood up. I decided to go, but as I turned, I heard a low, guttural growl from outside. I froze, my flashlight casting long shadows that danced on the walls. The growl got closer, and then I saw it, a large, dark shape moving outside the broken window. My heart raced as I bolted out of the cabin and back into the forest. I ran blindly, branches slashing against my face, my only goal to get as far away as possible from whatever was out there. The footsteps grew fainter, and the growl became a distant echo. Eventually, I stumbled back onto the main trail. I breathed heavily, following it back to my cabin, my flashlight barely cutting through the night. I didn't stop until I was inside, locking the door behind me and collapsing on the floor. The next morning, I went back to the cabin to get my things. The symbol on the wall was still there, but there was no sign of the dark figure or the growl. I never found out what had been following me, but I've learned to respect the forest and its secrets. I haven't ventured into those woods since. The forest remains a place of mystery and danger, and I know now that some paths are better left alone. But sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I still hear that low growl echoing in the dark, and I can't shake the feeling that whatever was out there is still waiting for me. It was supposed to be a chill weekend away from the city madness. I decided to go camping solo, something I'd done a few times hassle-free. I found a spot by a quiet lake deep in the woods. The view was perfect: tall trees, clear water, and a sky so clear I could see the Milky Way at night. The first night passed smoothly. I sat by the fire, listening to the crackling wood and the sounds of nature around me. The next day, I hiked and fished. As evening crept in, I set up my small campfire again, cooked dinner, and settled in. Just after sunset, I heard rustling in the bushes nearby. Probably a raccoon or deer, I thought. Didn't bother me much. As it got darker, the rustling grew louder and more frequent. Unease crept in. I aimed my flashlight towards the noise but saw nothing. Convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks and went to bed. I woke suddenly in the middle of the night. Something felt off. The forest was dead silent. No crickets, no owls, just eerie silence. Then I heard it again, the rustling, right outside my tent. Heart racing, I lay still, trying to figure out what it could be. Decided to check it out. Quietly unzipped my tent, stepped out with flashlight in hand, and pointed it towards the bushes. Again, nothing. Took a few steps away, scanning the area. Snap! A branch behind me broke. Whipped around. In the dim light I saw a man. Dirty, clothes torn, wild eyes. We stared. Didn't say a word. Slowly back towards my tent, eyes fixed on him. He stayed put. Reached my tent, grabbed my pack, and bolted. Ran through the woods, stumbling over roots and branches, not caring about noise. Just needed to flee. Reached my car, breathless, shaking. Fumbled for keys, started the engine, and sped off. Didn't stop till the nearest town. Pulled into a gas station, locked doors, and sat there, trying to calm down. Next day, it sank in how lucky I'd been. Never knew what that guy wanted. Reported it to authorities. They promised to look into it, but heard nothing more. Changed me. Love nature but cautious now. No more solo camping. Always let someone know where I am. That weekend reminded me, nature's beautiful but can also be unpredictable, dangerous. As I drove away, a chill ran down my spine. What if he wasn't alone out there? I've always liked the forest. There's something about the tall trees and the sound of leaves rustling that makes me feel good. So when I heard about a hidden forest trail that not many people knew about, I wanted to check it out. It was late afternoon when I started walking. The sun was low, making long shadows on the path. The trail was narrow and winding, almost like a path animals would use. I followed it deeper and deeper into the woods, enjoying the quiet. After about an hour, I saw the path starting to disappear. I thought about turning back, but I was too curious. I kept going, pushing through the bushes until I came to a small open area. In the middle of the clearing was an old, broken-down cabin. It looked like no one had been there in years. The windows were smashed, and the door was barely hanging on. Something about it felt wrong, but I didn't know what. I decided to look closer. The door made a creaking sound as I pushed it open, showing a dark, musty room inside. I stepped in, and that's when I smelled it. At first, it was faint, but as I walked further into the cabin, it got stronger. It was the rotten smell of something dead. My heart started beating faster as I followed the smell to a small room at the back of the cabin. There, on the floor, was a pile of animal bones. They looked like they'd been there a long time. But the weirdest part was that they were arranged in a circle, with a big stone in the middle. Something inside me said I needed to get out of there, fast. I turned to leave but stopped when I heard a rustling sound coming from the woods outside. I froze, listening. The rustling got louder, closer. I could hear footsteps now, slow and steady. I ran out of the cabin and back towards the trail, my heart pounding. The footsteps followed, always just behind me. I didn't look back. I just kept running, pushing through the bushes until I finally got back to the trail. I didn't stop until I reached my car. I jumped in, locked the doors, and drove away, not daring to look back. It wasn't until I was miles away that I finally let myself breathe. I never went back to that forest. I don't know what was in that cabin or who, or what, was following me. But I do know one thing: some places are best left alone. Sometimes, late at night, I can still hear those footsteps outside my window. And I wonder if whatever was in that forest followed me home.